Sometimes I begin to worry that the aging process will be less kind to me than I had hoped. More days than not, I sit down to write an email or a text, and I struggle to remember the name of the person I want to communicate with. I just can't seem to recall their name. So I stare at that empty field on my phone or my computer, and I've learned to type in any random letter, and usually the artificial intelligence algorithm in my phone or my computer will suggest a name. Sometimes it's the right name, but usually not. But in either case, it generally primes the pump of my brain enough for me to actively remember who it was that I wanted to communicate with. I recently heard that this trick of priming the brain is a way of accessing our implicit memory. And it's not something we tend to think about much when we talk about memory. We usually, when we're talking about memory, are talking about our conscious elements of it. You know, like those memory matching card games we play with our children or our grandchildren? And this is how researchers and scientists have often studied the memory powers of our brains, with lists and such memory card games. But work with individuals with amnesia revealed something new about our brains. You see, there is an unconscious component to our memory centers. When researchers tried to understand what was happening with individuals suffering from amnesia, they would give them the typical tests and ask them to remember a list of words. They'd come back the next day, and when the researcher asked them to remember the words, you can imagine just how the scene would play out. Of course, these individuals would smile, kind of anxiously, and look at them strangely and say, "What words are you talking about?" They couldn't even remember having been given the words in the first place. Now, if the scientists approached in an indirect manner, they discovered that they could gain access to the data from a list of words that had previously given them, the amnesiacs. So they presented the individuals with a piece of paper with a single letter on it, let's say the letter M. And they asked the individual to complete the word with the first word in their minds that started with the letter M. And each time they did this, they found the individuals could actually bring back one of the words from the list with no active memory of learning. When they did it with other starting letters, they realized they could almost recreate the entire list from the individual's implicit memory. You see, implicit memory is a form of long-term memory that doesn't require any conscious retrieval. And there are several types of implicit memory, including procedural memory, priming, like I talked about earlier, and conditioning. Together, these three subtypes help us carry out everyday tasks without us even thinking about it, from riding a bike to brushing your teeth to having a conversation with someone without even listening. It's a reminder that the unconscious center of our brains is always working implicitly, and that we're always piecing together and creating the world for us, even when we can't see it at work. Of course, the discovery of implicit memory has created a window into the ways that our minds work in shaping the world. Harvard professor Maharajan Bahanji extended this research into implicit memory into the way that it forms implicit biases. She created that famous implicit association test, which demonstrates that the unconscious centers of the brain carry implicit values, of which we're not even aware. In this speed test, if you haven't taken it, one is asked to identify and differentiate between two classes of objects, let's say insects and flowers, by hitting two keys when they're flashed on the screen, I for insect, F for flower. In a series of associated secondary texts, each of these categories is now matched with adjectives. And as you may imagine, it's easier for our brains to associate positive adjectives like beautiful with a rose than it is with a cockroach, for instance. The implicit associations are indicated much quicker and easier than when we have to deliberately and consciously partner unlikely pairs. When was the last time you thought about scurrying cockroach as cute? Now, not surprisingly, this test reveals the same implicit biases we look at when we see our fellow brothers and sisters. The ways that we look down on those whose skin is the wrong color, whose gender is seen as weaker, whose sexual orientation is divergent, whose waist size is seen as deplorable, or whose disability is seen as the sum of their value. Now, long before this research could explain the nature of implicit memory and bias, ancient wisdom traditions prompted us to pause so that we might consider how we look at the world. The spirituality of this wisdom tradition invites us to contemplate beyond the visible binaries of the world and to see the hidden wholeness and oneness in all things. Of course, this is precisely what's going on in today's texts, starting with that famous character in the Hebrew Bible, David. In this story, we see that God has shaken the prophet Samuel out of his grief, the grief of a failed leader that he had picked and anointed, and given him a kick in the behind to go out and sent him to anoint a new king. And here's where the story gets interesting, for it unveils our hidden biases. The chosen one is not one whom we would expect it to be. It's not the oldest of Jesse's sons, not even the second in line, nor any of the 7 other sons who are in quite dramatic fashion paraded before Samuel, but found not to be the chosen one. When Samuel rather despondently asks whether there is no one else, Jesse finally remembers David. Maybe he was given a slip of paper with a D on it, and his implicit memory sparked. The 8th son, that's right, the youngest. This king-to-be is also not the one with the most imposing stature, nor one who looks like a king in terms of societal norms. Through Samuel, we are reminded that God does not see as humans see, that look at the outward appearance, but God looks into the heart of things, into the nature of things as they truly are. And it shouldn't be surprising how quickly we forget the way of looking and the return to the unconscious wiring of our minds, the way that privileges certain ways of being. Despite the exhortation of the letter to the Ephesians calling us to awake and see the world in a new light, we, like the disciples in the gospel, tend to fall back on old patterns. Walking alongside Jesus, they noticed a blind man, and they expose their implicit bias and ask, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And can we blame them? The worldview of the ancient Near East labored under a clear cause and effect world of karma. You do something bad, and you suffer the consequences. Or sometimes the punishment is delayed, and you suffer the consequence of the penalties of your parents' misdeeds. In such a world, if you observe calamitous effects in someone's life, you can assume they did wrong. As an aside, I have to wonder how much our worldviews have shifted. Don't we frequently blame the victim for their own misfortune? We too continually lack the vision that Prophet Samuel endorses, that sees to the heart of the matter. Thank God for Jesus, though. He does see into the oneness of life, and it is his seeing he shows our blindness. I imagine Jesus stopping and looking into the eyes of his friends as he answers, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so God's works might be revealed in him." He offers these words not judgmentally, but imploringly and lovingly. He wants his followers and friends to see as he sees, that with God, the abundance of life, a life truly worth living, that it's always available to us, whatever our condition, if only we have the eyes to see it, if only we're not trapped in the past or by our implicit biases. I was struck by one feature in this narrative as I read the story. Maybe you heard it too when Kathy read it. And it's the persistence of the characters, the crowd, and even us, the readers, to cling to the former identity of the main character. Throughout the narrative, he's called the man born blind, the man who had been blind, the man who used to beg, and even called the blind man, even after Jesus has healed him. All of these designations invite us to understand him in terms of what he used to be, and notably in terms of his limitations. Perhaps we do it with an intention to recognize what this man has overcome. But I wonder if that roots us too quickly and firmly in the past and risks defining him in terms of previous limitations only. If this story is about opening our eyes to see the world in new ways, not limited by our old implicit biases or old ways of looking at the world, why do we cling so hard to the old and the familiar? As the current research suggests, our unconscious or implicit memory has a way of holding us captive, forcing us to define ourselves in terms of our limiting factors or even the difficult things we've experienced. Even if we've overcome them and take a measure of pride in that, I still wonder if it does justice to our current reality or links us too strongly to the past. When we talk about someone as divorced or widowed, for instance, are we honoring a significant relationship that has ended or defining someone in terms of what they once were? Even the term like cancer survivor, which I know has many positive associations for those who've endured diagnosis and treatment and come out the other side grateful for their recovery, can I imagine risk defining a person in terms of what they've overcome and reducing to them to who they were in a single dimension. Our stories are always more complex than just one element. In this story, it seems like it's just really, really hard for the people around the man who received his sight to adjust to this new reality, or to see him for anything other than who he used to be. And so some folks don't recognize him at all. Others, including his parents, know what he struggled with and see his transformation, but aren't sure of what to make of it. How often have we fallen into that trap ourselves? Either by not seeing the changes in someone's lives, or perhaps feeling boxed in ourselves too. Whenever we walk our road of recovery, whenever we try and imagine a new possibility for ourselves, how often do those around us try and shove us back in the box that we used to live in? This morning, I have to wonder, what is holding us captive? What is holding us back from seeing the world of possibility that Jesus promises us? Jesus isn't caught in a world of implicit memory or bias. He's geared to the future. This morning, I think we have to ask ourselves, what designations, what self-definitions no longer serve us? How have you understood yourself solely in terms of a tragedy or a challenge or a limitation that's making it impossible for you to keep growing and changing? Today, Jesus invites us to see differently. Jesus is the prompt that primes us to grasp hold of the open future that God's grace and forgiveness and resurrection provide. All of these facets are in our past and deep in our implicit memory. We just need the prompt to access them. Today, I invite you to let your implicit memory be renewed so that you may see the world as one of possibility. You may see the world like God does. And we have access to this divine way of knowing. It's deep in our human consciousness because Jesus put it there. And God put it there before him. We just need to open our eyes and wake to it, to see the potential that we have and not the limitation. This morning, I invite you, I implore you, open your eyes. Look again. Let the word of God's loving embrace shape and fill in the world as your mind creates it. We have a role to join God in co-creating this dream that God has for us. Will you be part of God's dream? I hope so. Amen.